Kia ora mai tātou, ngā mihi nui, i ngā rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this webinar, which is an opportunity for you to talk with myself and three of my panel colleagues, Brendan Boyle, Gail Surgener and Penny Holst. We have apologies today from Antoine Coffin. Today, hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at our report, and we saw today as an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panel and for them to share their perspectives and some of the background to either some of our recommendations or our thinking. If you haven't read the report and you've just seen some of the media comments, then your questions might be a little different, but this isn't an opportunity for us to present the report to you. We hope you've had an opportunity to view that yourself. Perhaps by way of introductory comment, a question that's been asked of us is what's next for the review, and as a panel our work concludes this week. At the end of this week, the panel has completed its role, and the review passes, in terms of an administrative secretarial sense, passes to the Department of Internal Affairs, and it will then be a matter for the Minister, the Department and local government, in particular LGNZ, to work through what the next steps are in advancing the recommendations from our review. So welcome this morning. It's really a Q&A session, and we've enabled the webinar so that you can raise your hand and speak if you wish, if you've got any questions that you want to explore with the panel. And alternately, you can put your comment in the chat, and we would, the team will corral those and feed those through to the panel. So hopefully that makes sense to people. And if someone would like to kick off with a question for the panel, we will work among ourselves to provide our best answer. And it starts with Kit. I see has got his hand up. So kia ora.
Right, can you hear me, Jim?
Yes, strongly, Kit. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning to the panel. Nice to see you all. Two sort of questions. One, I've seen a positive response from local government in New Zealand and others around, because I've been away, actually visiting the North Island for the last 10 days. So I got back on Monday. So I looked at it while I was away. And I must say, I saw better roads in the North Island than I do in the South. So that's a bit of an issue. I'd love to talk to Waka Kotahi about that. The standard of roads are much better in the North Island. But a positive response from local government in New Zealand. But what sort of response, if any, from the Minister or the Department of Internal Affairs?
Thanks, Kit. Yes, LGNZ's response has been very supportive of the review, generally of the review findings, and acknowledge that there's significant amount of work that now needs to be done to pick up on the review and take that to its next stage. From the Minister, the Minister's press release has been pretty much along the lines of, I'd like to hear from local government New Zealand and local government about what it thinks about the review, and to receive that advice and then consider that advice. I think as a panel, we're always conscious that given when the report landed in the election cycle, that any firm decisions are going to be made by the next government, and they will be looking for advice both from local government New Zealand and the Department of Internal Affairs, along with others, no doubt, to gauge their response. But in the first instance, they're very much interested to see what local government's response to the report is.
Right, so I don't think I'm muted. So I would have thought at the conference next month, that would be a good time for us to be able to discuss it informally, face-to-face, because I much prefer face-to-face interactions. And will any of you be at the conference?
we're all going to be at the conference. Gail and Penny have some roles within the formal program of the conference, but all of the panel are going to be at the conference, and we'd be more than happy to talk about the review and our findings.
Good. Thanks for that. Thanks,
Kit. Glad you enjoyed your the tour of the North Island. I'm sure there are some on the Hawke's Bay and the Bay of Plenty or Coromandel will probably say their roads are not in their best shape, but great to hear that the rest of the network seems to be sound. Mike Kerr, you've come off mute. Did you have something that you wanted to share or ask?
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, look, I put this question online. Probably a little bit disappointed with your recommendations, but I'm particularly disappointed there was nothing there on civics education in terms of enabling a lot of the things you're wanting to do. And I just want to understand why that was not included when it was well supported across the board.
And one of my panel colleagues might want to pick up on that. Mike, we concur. Civics education is really important, and throughout in addition to the 17 recommendations, throughout our report are a number of what we've called suggestions and ideas that we would hope get picked up on. And certainly when we talked about participation levels and encouraging not only youth to participate, we also made it very clear that it needed to be accompanied by strong civics education, and we strongly support civics education not only for children or for young adults, but I think actually a broader program of civics education would be beneficial and to have available, because as you probably know, there are a number of people in our communities who haven't necessarily got the strongest grasp of how New Zealand's democracy is structured and the part particularly local government plays.
Yeah, look, I have been making my way through the report and I haven't found anything on it at this stage. So and particularly not in the key summary areas, so I think it's, maybe it is in there, but it's not. For me, I was hoping to see a much stronger push on it.
Acknowledge that. For matters that haven't made their way to our key 17 recommendations, and the reason we were keen to limit the number of recommendations in our report so that they then became the focus of the report. We've seen other reports that have, 100 or more recommendations, and each recommendation dilutes the one next to it. So that was the rationale for fewer recommendations. But throughout the report, there's probably more than a dozen other what you'd call little recommendations, and I'd certainly put civics education in as one of those other recommendations that we anticipate that particularly the government officials, as they work their way through the report and look to think about how they implement this, take those on board. And Gail's got some, and Brendan have both got some comments to add.
We're just going. Oh, you go, Gail. I was just going to say that in both, in fact, in all three of our publications, the interim, the draft, and the final, Mike, there is definitely statements here about the need for civics, but we also point out some people.
Hi, Karen, how are you?
Hi, Helen. Sorry about that. I actually.
Thanks, Helen.
Some people assume that that's just part of building it into the school curricula, and that may well be part of improving civics, even though there is actually modules in the school curriculum currently. But we also see it as a responsibility of local government in terms of civics within your own communities and lifting the bar there in terms of engagement. But there's definitely commentary in the democracy chapter. Gail.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, and just that when we recommend lowering the voting age to include 16 and 17-year-olds, we've said that should include a greater focus on civics education. So I echo what the other panel members have said about that as a collective responsibility, not just schools' responsibility, but it's something that local government as a whole can get better engaged with.
Okay, thank you for that.
Kit, I see your hand is still up. If you've got another question you want to pose to the panel.
Well, there could be several.
That's all good.
The one I thought in terms of the GST and the sharing of finance, that will be a significant hurdle for governments to swallow. But having just been through an annual plan where we've had to bite the bullet and lift our rates by 8.57% and the started work on the long-term plan, which looks very difficult for us in Tasman. But I was in the South Wairarapa on Saturday and read a local paper that indicated they were having a rates increase north of 20%. So, there is really difficulty in local government with funding going forward, and being able to change that, I think, is one of the key things. So I support where you're going, but I think getting central government to share revenue with us will come with some strings, because when you get something given to you, they control something that you do. So do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Kit. And certainly funding is one of the critical elements. It's not the only element that's important, but certainly we acknowledge that the system is pretty well tapped out, and rates councils are really struggling. Obviously, the current inflationary environment is making it really tough for councils as well, notwithstanding all of the existing and future challenges that sit there. And so there does need to be a far greater contribution from central government, and our report makes probably 3 major recommendations in that regard. And I'll come back to the one about the $1 billion transfer that we talk about. The first is how we work together and agreeing what are the outcomes, objectives and priorities at place. And as part of our report, we're saying central government and local government should have an obligation, or must have an obligation, to come together and agree those at place and what the respective investment programs and plans look like to help address those particular outcomes and priorities. So we anticipate over time that should become a significant part of the funding transfer from central to local government. But in addition to that, and particularly initially, we think the suggestion of $1 billion contribution transfer from central government to local government, and just a couple of comments around it. Firstly, I've heard and seen some commentary which says this is a return of GST to local government. While the quantum is the same amount as roughly as the GST that is collected on rates, it is not a straight return of GST to the council who had to pay the GST, or the citizens who had to pay the GST. Rather, it is a sum that is then allocated to councils, and we've suggested a model that's not hugely dissimilar from the FAR model used for roading, which enables there to be an allocation based on population, geography, deprivation, and we've added tourism and non-resident impacts into that, so that we can, so that each gets a share of that $1 billion, and we've provided some conditions around, or some suggestions and principles about how that funding should be applied, that it comes to local government as of right, that it's not contestable, that local government is in charge of determining of how it's applied. We have suggested that it should have a focus of additionality, which is, rather than just being used as an offset against the current rate requirement, that it is used to invest both in the council's capacity and capability and some of those local priorities that might otherwise not get funded, along with investment in innovation and experimentation and the like. So we hope that provides a boost to local government. The third recommendation, which has been recommended forever, is that central government pay rates on all of its properties, and we know all of those are going to be challenging. We recognise and acknowledge that the current fiscal position of New Zealand is challenging. It's difficult, and it's difficult for the government as well. They've got they have the same challenges in many ways as local government does, although we think they've got more capacity. So probably the final point before I pass to Brendan is, we are taking a long-term view in our review, and therefore, it may not all happen on day one, but hopefully it will happen. Brendan.
Thanks, Jim. I was just going to add, I noted that Peter had raised a question around what, if any, have we got from the government in terms of response around the funding. Peter, nothing specific in terms of commitments, but definitely an acknowledgement in our initial conversations with ministers that something does, need to be done around the funding. Our sense, though, and this is not by any means a response from ministers, but our sense is that government is unlikely to want to pour a lot more money into the existing system, which is why we had, packaged up a series of recommendations around strengthening the system, and that creating a more compelling investment proposition for central government so that there's some quid pro quo, and that, local government can really put some pressure on central government to fund what is essentially a new model of local government.
Yeah.
Just noting that we've got another question in the chat, Jim, from Steve Walker. Can you expand the pros and cons on the suggestion regarding the potential for co-funding related to civic and social infrastructure along the same lines as the current Waka Kotahi model? So that's from Councillor Steve Walker in Dunedin.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I might invite Gail to make some comments in terms of co-investment and social and civic infrastructure first. Gail.
One of the things that we heard really clearly from local government was that there was a great appetite to do more in the wellbeing space, but there were funding constraints. And we've raised the social and civic infrastructure as key contributors to more upstream prevention of some of the big issues that central government has the levers and the resources for, and wellbeing, for example, in the health system, education and social services. And think that if there was a greater investment in the kind of social and civic infrastructure that local government is currently providing, then there'd be better community wellbeing outcomes and maybe less pressure on central government spend in the deficit areas of poor health or social problems. We've heard about the potential that libraries have as community hubs, but they're not invested in or utilised by central government, for example. So this is just raising the issue that there's a lot of potential to co-invest with local government to make a difference at a community level.
And just
to finish off, that infrastructure isn't just roads and rubbish and water. Social and civic infrastructure is just as important, especially when we're going to have to join up to address complex issues like climate change, cost of living pressure, economic and social challenges.
I know I'll get you to comment on the far rate issue, but just to add to what Gail's saying, there's excellent work already being done looking at co-investment in sports infrastructure, sport and rec infrastructure, and looking at joining up with schools to improve access for communities to fields that can then be funded and supported by council. There's a lot of work being done in Auckland in a funding constrained environment. This makes sense. And then when you bring in health funding as well and look at the provision of sport and rec as an aid to community health, that's where I think we could really get cooking with gas. And for councils to be the provider of infrastructure that can have a multitude of funders and a multitude of purposes, I think is where the future's at. Thank you.
Thanks. And we see there are two mechanisms or two approaches going on. One is bespoke agreements, place-based agreements between central government and local government to deal with the priorities at place, and that is in addition to the $1 billion that we are suggesting is transferred from central government to local government, and that the allocation of the $1 billion is where we're suggesting that FAR model can be adapted to ensure an equitable distribution of that funding across the nation, so that every council gets a fair share of it. Importantly, we're saying it's funding as of right. So while it was an amount equivalent to the Provincial Growth Fund, and we saw lots of good happen through the Provincial Growth Fund, that was a contestable model, and we don't see this basis being contestable at all. There is some accountability around it, though. While the funding is allocated and it's up to local, along with their communities, to decide how that is applied, there is some accountability mechanisms that we would propose that a council should be able to demonstrate what they have actually achieved and use that funding for. We think that's fair, seeing it as a transfer from central government. There needs to be some accountability back for its use and application. We have a question from Fiona.
Tēnā koutou katoa, mihi nui kia koutou. So I'm a councillor in Ruapehu District Council, and I just we've had a lot going on in Ruapehu, as you probably all know. So we're doing some bit of a catch up with the review, but I think I've been part of it for a while now. And I just had some questions around the figure 10 on page 111. I suppose just a bit more explanation around that model.
Oh, right.
So for those of you who don't have your report near to you, and in the printed version it comes out at page 112. But what it is a trying to differentiate between the relational Crown Department that we're proposing and a new stewardship institution that we are recommending.
If you've got a chance, I think it would be good to.
Thank you. So the intent of that diagram is to limit the amount of confusion about what both of those entities do. So we are proposing a new government department, and that is focused on particularly the central local government relationship, aligning the central government and local government activity to deliver better value for communities, to be able to act as a broker, if you like, in the system between central government departments, and 20 or 30 government departments, all with different priorities, are difficult to something that they're as difficult to work with as central government claims working with 78 councils. So bringing all government departments together in one place, we hope that they will enable and facilitate a more joined up public service. They would be the entity that we see negotiating any place-based agreements or city deals or the like in place. So that role is really focused on I'll say the day-to-day relationship between central and local government, whereas we're also proposing a new stewardship institution. And we're saying that that is an institution that provides stewardship of the whole of the system of local government. It looks at the health and well-being and fitness of the whole local government system. So it's thinking about the health of local democracy, the strength of local democracy, looking at how the cumulative impacts of central government work are impacting local government, and also therefore on its capacity and capability of the system. It's also, we suggest it should also be able to assess and provide commentary on the strength of the local government Māori relationship. So it plays a role more strongly than the individual current stewards that we've identified in the system, and the current stewards being the Minister, the Department of Internal Affairs and the Secretary of Internal Affairs, Local Government New Zealand, Tai Tūranga, and the Local Government Commission. We're also saying that stewardship institution should pick up the roles and responsibilities of the Local Government Commission as well. So it's a body that provides guidance, support, is an actual champion for local government, but is somewhat independent and objective in its discharge of its responsibilities. Brendan, you want to make some additional comments,
yeah, just some additional comments based on a couple of questions that have come into the chat. So Tim Cadogan had asked about the place-based agreements, and you'd mentioned that. So what we felt there, Tim, was that the new government agency would be the central point of integration or broker to get these place-based agreements in place, up and running. The devil's in the detail, of course. So, you know, if it was your district, obviously, if you were seeking an agreement, it would be different than it would be potentially in a place like Northland. So it's got to be relevant to your own context. So that may mean a different range of government agencies that could be part of that deal. In terms of who would administer them, we haven't been prescriptive around that, and we think that needs to be worked through between Local Government New Zealand and the Crown. There has to be some form of, if you like, monitoring or at least an understanding of how progress and what measures, if any, are required. So that would need to be worked through in terms of the establishment of the agreement. And then there was also a question around ending up with 2 more layers of bureaucracy, and that's fair. We were really concerned about that as well, but the trade-off with the creation of the new government agency is, at the moment, there is no real sort of single point of integration across the Crown. One might argue that that is part of the role of DIA, but it doesn't have that explicit mandate to the extent that this new Crown agency would. We've modelled the premise on the Te Ara Whiti relationship model. So it is a relational entity, but with some specific accountabilities. So we think that's worth that trade-off in terms of putting some more bureaucracy in place. And the other element that was asked was, would the current LGNZ be morphed into that? And that's really a matter for LGNZ to address. But in essence, no, we thought that in reality, the sector was still going to probably have a membership-based organisation that sits independent to those Crown organisations and the stewardship entity.
Yeah, our report makes no recommendation in regards to LGNZ nor Tai Tūranga, and that's a matter for both organisations to work through in light of the whatever change occurs following our review, for them to think how best they can support their members. Gail.
We share the concern that we don't want to see another layer of bureaucracy or a barrier between local and central government, but we were very mindful that there'd already been a toolkit produced about trying to improve the relationship between local and central government. There were the local government branch and the partnership directors and various other ideas, but they weren't enough to reset the relationship. We think that it's such a big job that it needs the kind of infrastructure that this new relational entity will provide, and the capability and capacity to do the setting up of the place-based deals and really getting to the bottom of what it's going to take to reset the relationship between local and central government to be on a more even keel and to be more productive. That was one of the things that we heard from the local government sector loud and clear. If there was one thing this review could make a difference to, then that alone would have been worth it. And we just don't think it can happen without this kind of capacity to work on it.
Probably one last comment I'd make is, while that's a structural solution, what we're really seeking are changes in culture and mindsets. And we think that the relational department, with a particular focus on local government, actually has the opportunity of central government actually getting local government and understanding it and having a vested interest in the success of local government. And I'm not saying that DIA don't, but this would give far more capacity and capability and investment, and hopefully start the cultural change that is needed within central government agencies as well, about how to work and partner more effectively, and the value that local government offers communities, and recognising and enabling that value to be unlocked.
There's a follow-up question from Hayley around leveraging collective buying power, shared services, etc. that's come through in the chat. So yeah, Hayley, short answer is yes, that the stewardship organisation could play a role in terms of good practice and best practice and facilitating or brokering that across the sector. We're conscious of the fact that there's a range of shared services arrangements in place already across local government, but we think there's an opportunity for probably greater leverage and a more sophisticated approach to it. And I think there's an interesting question about shared services versus managed services. So the difference between the two is, in a shared services model, you might have one council providing that on behalf of providing some back office services like finance, IT on behalf of other councils, or you could collectively come together and say, well, actually, we need a particular service. And then you actually go to the market and purchase it as a managed service on behalf of the entire sector or a range of councils. A few years back, there was a really, really good report done by Local Government New Zealand on shared services and managed services, but it hasn't gone very far. So a lot of that thinking is already there. You don't need a massive local government reform to make that happen, but the stewardship organisation could certainly play a role in helping push that ahead. But of course, that's not going to be up and running for a while, and we have recommended that, you know, the shared services model is an early cab off the rank that should be advanced by the sector, and we think there's great opportunities there.
Fiona, you've got your hand up still. You have some other questions you'd like to pose to the panel?
Oh, kia ora anō. I really like the parts about the system of change and participation and equity, and those key elements. But I have still got my reservations and concerns about if your recommendations go far enough to bring about that. I think if you're looking to change a whole system and really seek equity, especially in places, small towns like Taumaranui and Raitahi, for example, and the Ruapehu, really need to leverage up. I don't know if enforce is the word, but how are we going to get that with some recommendations that I think are just a wee bit. I think Kiwis have a real. We've got a real niceness about us, and I don't know if nice is going to do it, or is it going to do it very quickly to bring around transformational change. Yeah, so I just wondered if outcomes would be a more productive way to look at things, to outcomes for those that live in inequity and have lived in inequity for a long time, and when you're setting out to bring local governments into the well-being frame, then then yeah, real transformational change needs to happen within there. I don't know if elected members of public can do that by themselves without being equipped and well resourced and educated about what actually are the inequities. And democracy is a lovely thing, but when you're elected, it really is a popularity vote, and so therefore lies a problem that the most popular will represent and have mindsets of the people that voted for them, and those aren't necessarily the people that live in inequity. So, how are we going to bring about these changes for well-being for those people that aren't represented well? And even though the government did move into Māori ward space, I think that's an opportunity to bring out equity throughout the nation instead of something that is done if there's a loud voice that is willing to concern themselves week after week in a voluntary mode to make something happen. I think, and I'll speak from my Māoritanga and Te Ao Māori, I think that because we have been suppressed for so long, and our tikanga has been taken off us for 180 years, we've become normalised to believe that what we get is good enough and is what we deserve, when in actual fact it's really not. So from returning to, if I'll give you an example, returning to my hometown of Taumaranui from Australia, and realising that it was normal to be on minimum wage. It was normal for my nieces and nephews and even my mother to be on minimum wage, so that the average wage of a Māori living in Ruapehu is less than $22,000 is just not good enough. So if we're looking at, if you're looking at recommending a system that's going to lift that, then I don't know if you've gone far enough to push that through so that the next generation at least could have benefit of it.
Thanks, Fiona. Really great question and reflection, and I know Gail and Penny will both want to chip in and reply to that. Gail.
Thanks, Fiona. I think you've done a great job of articulating what some of the big challenges facing Aotearoa New Zealand are in terms of equity. And we're not proposing to have all the answers, although we are trying to create a platform where place-based approaches are more successful, and that local communities get the opportunity to solve problems with local solutions rather than it all trying to be done at a central government from Wellington level. You might have noticed that last week, as well as our report coming out, there was also a report called Fair Chance for All by the Productivity Commission, and it canvasses lots of things that you've mentioned as well. And there's quite a lot of crossover and synergy between our report and recommendations and the Productivity Commission. So these reviews, reports, along with a recent one from the Kōtuku Centre at Auckland University about social cohesion, are saying similar things about the level of change that's needed at a central government, local government, community level. These issues of entrenched inequity aren't going to be solved by one sector alone. That's why we've been so strong about the joined up nature of partnerships across local government with Hapuiwi Māori, with central government and business, community organisations. It's going to take all of us together in a cohesive way to shift the dial on entrenched or persistent disadvantage and inequity that plays out in place. And what you described in Taumaranui about the low levels of incomes and people's aspirations aren't as high as they could be, that's the kind of situation that probably can only really be solved from a bottom-up local level. the Productivity Commission report talks about whānau-centred, locally led, centrally enabled approaches need to be developed. And I think that's very consistent with what we're saying as well. So it's a collective effort.
Just to add to that, and kia ora Fiona, thank you for putting that so well. You've touched on the point that, you know, politics can be a popularity contest, and often it's the voices of people who are enabled, powerful, and, you know, resourced are the voices that are heard the loudest. We spend a lot of time in our report talking about different ways of delivering democracy through deliberative and active participatory democracy practices, and that's all about swapping that out and giving voice to people who at the moment are kind of silent in communities. And by handing the power back to citizens to participate more actively in a way that is representative of what the communities genuinely are, that's where I think we can start to make change to the way that LTPs are set up, with the way that councils advocate and how they understand who their people are. So, you know, I know some people are not necessarily that delighted about us pushing deliberative democracy, but I think that's one of the real levers to pull to start making that change. Kia ora.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol and Penny. There's a question in the Q&A about method of voting and STV, or what we're proposing is ranked voting. And Brendan, did you want to just summarise that question and provide a response?
So I thought it would be a really good one for Penny, who's probably got more experience, you know, firsthand in the local voting system. So I'm going to flick that one down the chain.
It's not a hot potato. It's just finding the right person to catch the potato.
I do understand, and you know, I've been guilty. Look, I'll put my hand up and say, you know, when the representation reviews would come around council and we'd go, should we think about STV? And we'd all go, oh my God, it's just too hard. And you know, besides, I got elected by first past the post, and do I want to change the system? But you know, life does move on, and the need to change is more clearly understood now than it's ever been understood. STV quite clearly delivers a more democratically representative outcome, and it is confusing, but I know up here in Auckland, our DHBs, we voted with STV, we voted first past the post for council, licensing trust, local boards, and the huge complexity that is Auckland, and people managed well. Just going back to the discussion, I think the first question around civics education, and I do have to say civics education appears on page 89. So just for the reference, I think, Mike, you raised that. If we are successful in changing to STV as a more just and a better way of voting, it is going to need a pretty serious piece of education and information alongside it.
Thanks, Penny. And STV is confusing when you hear it, and we're actually suggesting a simpler name is just ranked voting, from a, you know, rank your candidates in order. It is conceptually a lot easier than trying to understand what single transferable vote actually means, and you don't need to know the mechanics behind it. Brendan, did you want to add something more?
I was just going to comment on the next question that came through in the chat. So if you want to move, will I do that? Yeah.
And we've got a hand up. We'll do that next.
Yeah. So there's a question from Celine around, you know, the minister's comments around hearing from the sector. Celine, I mean, this is really just about the politics of this, bearing in mind that you've got a government that's probably feeling a bit bruised around its relationship with the sector and wanting to be really careful in terms of its response. And also, as we heard really clearly from then Prime Minister at the local government conference in 2022, this will happen if local government wants this to happen. So I think, you know, the ball at the moment politically is in the court of local government. And the more you can come together unanimously as a collective voice to put pressure on central government in terms of advancing this review, the stronger position you're going to be in. Whichever government, is in, or flavour of government is in power post-October. So I think that's our sort of advice as a panel, really come together as a sector, have a strong voice, figure out what you like and don't like, what you're prepared to advance, what your sectoral priorities are, present that to an incoming government in a really coordinated way. And I think that'll put you in the best position to advance this review.
Thanks, Brendan. There's a question from with a hand up, and apologies, it's either Gil or Jill, and I'm not quite sure which. So it'll become evident in a second when you begin speaking. Welcome.
Kia ora tātou. Yes, it's Jill. It is confusing, but you can call me Gil.
Jill, lovely to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And thank you, Brendan, for what you just said then, because it clarifies my thinking. So what I was most excited about in the report was the clear support for resourcing civics education actually within local government. So helping us to understand and facilitate more cohesion between our Māori constituents and where we're coming from a largely Pākehā middle class platform. And I acknowledge that I'm very much a middle class Pākehā, middle-aged, and I think that our council, I'm from the Rangatike, I think we've got it really good because we have a fantastic iwi committee, Te Roko Ahi Kā, who we consult with, and we have 2 Māori ward representatives as well. But even so, our cultural advisor is saying she can't cope. We have shared services across 2 districts, and she can't cope, and we need funding for that. And it concerns me when you say, of course, this is going to happen immediately, because we need it to happen immediately. And I see that you've got a 30-year lens, but if I was to say anything, I would really push the need for that to be supported, that education and bringing together of that understanding. We need central government to support that. So thank you for that I could see within the report. Just I'd also like to say another thing you said was to align planning cycles between local and central government, and that's so fundamental to me. I was concerned about the use of citizens' assemblies as a description that felt very, I don't know, Eastern Bloc. But anyway, I guess I'll get used to the new speak. Apart from that, thank you very much for your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, the investment in councils investing in themselves, and they're often reluctant to do it, but the capacity and capability issues that we highlight in the report, particularly about building a more authentic relationship with Māori, it really is and needs to be a priority and recognised as such. I know everything's a priority, and that's a challenge, and there needs to be more funding in the system, and we are suggesting that central government also needs to make a contribution in that space to lift the overall capability and capacity of local government systems. So that is something that we think is fundamental. If we don't address that, then we probably aren't going to make the progress that we all believe needs to be made in growing the relationship, which in many cases is fantastic, as you alluded to, but for many, I think we'd all acknowledge that there is a lot more to be done. Any other comments from the panel, or are there any other questions? Fergus and Ronnie, is there anything that you're seeing in either Q&A or chat?
Jim, just while everyone has a quick look, I just want to say thank you, Jill. Really appreciated your comments. And yes, citizens' assemblies do sound a little bit, it doesn't necessarily sound like the friendliest way to get together. But I do recommend that you Google some of the work that Democracy Next is doing, and it's such a great read. Some of these terms are slightly archaic because they do go back to sort of Greek times and the very birth of real democracy. But it's worth having a look at, and it certainly puts the power back in the hands of our communities. And for those of us who've been lucky enough to experience some of this work, it certainly is friendly, warm, cups of tea are involved, and it's welcoming and inclusive. So have a read.
Just while there's any questions coming, to just note that we are recording today's session, and that will go on our website. So if you or you have missed something, or your colleagues weren't able to attend and were interested what's covered, they can certainly go to the Future for Local Government website, and this recording will be there for people.
Just to say, I'm fairly sure all the questions have been answered, but one of the ones I might have missed, whether you responded to it or not, was the question from Martin Rodley about distribution of the $1 billion across regions.
Can you just read that question?
I'll read it out for you.
So
So without wanting to get bogged down in the $1 billion redistribution model, was there a discussion among the panel for deciding the basis for the $1 billion to be distributed? He's thinking that there are 3 main districts that have a high absentee ratepayers, and lots of the basis for central government funding is on census note figures. And in some areas of Coromandel Peninsula, there can sometimes be up to 70 to 80% absentee ratepayers.
Yeah, great. And thank you for that question. And certainly some councils submitted in that regard to the panel as well, and noted that the pressure that is applied both from tourism and non-resident ratepayers can be significant. And you're right, there are a handful who are more impacted than others. Yes, we believe that should be one of the criteria that's taken into account when considering the allocation of funding. So the 4 elements that we think are important are population, geography, deprivation, and the extent of tourist or non-resident impacts on a community, and trying to assess that, as you sort of imply in the question, can be a little difficult, but there certainly needs to be a recognition that some of those really struggle to be able to maintain services to what is often an absentee or intermittent number of citizens who require service. So yes, that is a factor that we do acknowledge. Kia ora. Okay, we seem to have run dry in terms of questions, and that's all good. We don't need to be here for any longer, and then we're actually coming up to 58 minutes past 9 in any event. So look, with that, I'm going to draw our Q&A to a close. Thank you to everybody who joined this morning, and particularly to those who have asked questions. Really appreciate that. Hopefully you found that of some value. We have a session particularly with executive staff this afternoon, and they too will get an opportunity to explore some of the matters with the panel. We're also catching up with iwi, hapu and Māori who want to know more about our report and have questions as well today. So look, thank you very much. We wish you all of the best in the challenges that lie in front of you, and from hopefully the opportunities that our report presents. With that, kia ora and ka kite.